Hi everyone, today we're talking about how to find volume of cubes and prisms. As a reminder, you do not need to write down everything that we'll cover in this video, but be sure to jot down important information and at least one example of each type of problem that we'll cover. Also remember that you can pause the video to jot down important notes, rewind to view information again, and fast forward if you think you got it. Be careful, make sure you don't fast forward too much that you miss out on something important. Okay, so to start off, volume is the total area inside of a three-dimensional shape. So if you think of your three-dimensional shape as SpongeBob, who has length, width, and depth, it's how much can fit into that three-dimensional shape. So since SpongeBob is a sponge, it'd be like how much water can SpongeBob absorb within his entire body. If you think about a 3D shape like a box, a rectangular prism, or a cube, you can think about how many smaller cubes can fit into that box. So we're talking about the space inside of a three-dimensional shape. It's not just on a surface now, it's like stuff it can contain. And when we talk about how to find the volume of prisms, it's important for us to remember what prisms are. So prisms, if you remember, they look like two-dimensional shapes being stretched out. So they have the same shape on the top and bottom bases. You can also think about it as having layers of the same 2D shapes stacked on top of each other. So I think about it as a Post-it pad because in a pad of Post-its, there's layers and layers of individual Post-it sheets that are stuck on top of each other. Make sure you have this written down before we move on and take a look at what we're talking about with the Post-it pads. Okay, so remember prisms are like layers and layers of Post-its in a Post-it pad. So when we talk about rectangular prism, it'll just be like those Post-it pads that are kind of like a rectangle shape, and if you had a whole packet of them. So the rectangular prism has the bases of a rectangle because each of these Post-it notes are not exactly a perfect square, they're rectangles. And there are Post-it notes in tons of different shapes. So these are just Post-it notes shaped like a rectangle. So a rectangular prism would be like if you bought a whole box full of them, because then there's tons and tons of layers of individual Post-it notes. So this right here is an example of a rectangular prism. And then for a cube, it would be just your standard Post-it pad, because those are the typical Post-it pad is a square. And if you have a bunch of them in a pad, it would be like layers and layers of those squares on top of each other to make a cube. And then these are less typical, but there are Post-it pads that are shaped like triangles. And this is a very, thin pad. It's almost like you're almost done with it, but it still does make a triangular prism. So what that means is each of those shapes stacked on top of each other is the shape of a triangle, and if you have a bunch of them layered on top of each other to make a pad, those are your layers. Okay, so it's like you have that same one being stretched out. And these diagrams here with the length times width and the layers being labeled, that should go into your notebook because that's going to help you a lot when we talk about the volume formula. Because the general formula for a prism, any prism, means that you first have to figure out what's the base shape. Figure out the area of that. And then you're going to multiply by the height of the prism because that's going to tell you how many layers there are. And it's basically a shortcut to figuring out the space inside. So for our rectangular prism, we have a rectangle for the base. To figure out the area, we do length times width. And then if we want to figure out how many total in here, we would take that multiplication product and multiply by the layers. So that's easier than us counting all the layers in there for the total. Same with the cube. I would take my length times width to get 1 of the squares, and then I would multiply by the layers to figure out all of them inside. Triangle's a little different, length times width divided by 2 because it's half of a rectangle. And I would take that area, that one area, and multiply by all the layers so that I don't have to count all of the layers inside. Again, make sure that this is in your notebook before we move on. Okay, so in case that was confusing, here is a picture of what we're talking about. If we had one layer, which was 1, 2, 3, 4 on this side, by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the other, means each of these rectangles is a 4 by 5, 4 times 5. So that means each layer has 20 cubes in them. You could count them. Each of the layers is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. But instead of counting them all, we're just multiplying, right? That's the shortcut. So there's 4 by 5, or 20, in each of these layers. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 layers. So instead of adding 20 4 times, 20 plus 20 plus 20 plus 20, the shortcut is just to take what we got when we multiplied it, 4 times 5, 20, and just multiply by 4 for all the layers. So that's what we're talking about. The area of the base shape is 4 times 5, length times width, and then we just multiply by the height. The height tells us how many layers. The height here was 4. So we're going to take the length times the width, and we're going to multiply by the height. So that's basically 4 times 5 times 4, which gives us the total of 80. Like I said, you could just take apart the whole thing and just count all those cubes in there, but this is just a shortcut. We see what the shape is at the bottom. It's a rectangle. The rectangle's area is 4 times 5, 20. And then instead of adding it 4 times, we multiply by 4, the amount of layers. Go ahead and jot this down as an example if you haven't done so yet. Okay. So again, the volume of a rectangular prism is just the length times the width, because that's going to give you the area of the rectangle, and we're going to multiply by the height of the entire thing to figure out how many layers. For a cube, it's a little different because all the sides are the same, right? Like in this example, it's 3 by 3 by 3. There's so many 3s. So instead of finding out the area of the square, being length times width, and multiplying by the height of the prism, you're basically just taking that same number and multiplying by itself 3 times, because it's the same number each time, compared to a rectangle, which is going to have different numbers. So for a cube, it's just that one number multiplied by itself 3 times for your 3 dimensions, your length, your width, and your height. All those are the same measurement, so just multiply them 3 times. And then lastly, we have the triangular prism, which we mentioned before. It is going to be your length times your width of your triangle, and then at the end you're going to multiply by your height. So you first want to figure out what the area is going to be for that base shape, and then once you figure that out, you multiply it by how tall or how many layers that shape is going to be. Be sure that these 3 important formulas, including the general formula for volume, is in your notebook, and then we're going to go on and do a couple of examples. All right, let's take a look at this example. This example is asking us for the volume of this shape. Let's see. We know we have to first figure out what kind of shape this is. This is a rectangular prism. So that means the base shape is going to be a rectangle. So I need to figure out the rectangle's area first, just one layer. So that's going to be 3 on this side, the length, multiplied by the width is going to be 4. So the rectangle's area is length times width, 3 times 4. And then remember, we still have to multiply by the height because that's going to tell us the layers. The height here is 4. So there's going to be 4 layers. So once I figure out how much the area is for one rectangle, I have to multiply by 4 because there's going to be 4 of them inside this shape. So this is going to be 3 times 4 is 12. Then multiply that by 4. That's going to be 48. So the answer is 48 cubic yards. Why is it cubic yards? Because each of these is yards. There's 3 yards, multiplied by 4 yards, multiplied by 4 yards. Yards times yards times yards is yards cubed. So however many dimensions you multiply by, that's going to also show up in your units. So let's try that out. 48 cubic yards. Okay, let's move on and talk about triangular prisms. So this one right here is a triangular prism. We know this because it looks like a camping tent, and it looks like it's a post-it pad with triangle-shaped post-its and a bunch of layers of them. So we first have to figure out the triangle's area. The triangle has a length of 3, and looks like this arrow is pointing to this height. Remember, height goes up and down, and it looks like the height is 3 as well. The triangle has length times width divided by 2. So that's very important because it's only half of a rectangle. So we're going to take that area, which is 3 times 3 divided by 2. And then remember, we still have to multiply by the height, which is the layers. This is like a triangular prism on its side. So the height is on its side. This is like, it was supposed to sit like this, but they put it on its side. So the height is on its side as well. Height should be going up and down, but since they put the shape on its side, the height is now going sideways. So there's a height of 2. It's like there's 2 layers there. So when we do the math, 3 times 3 is 9. 9 divided by 2 times 2. Well, this is divide by 2 and this is multiply by 2. They undo each other. I can take a number and divide by 2, but then when I multiply by 2 again, I go back to how it was before. So they cancel each other out. So the answer is actually 9. And it's 9 cubic millimeters because each of these was millimeters. 3 millimeters, 3 millimeters, and 2 millimeters. Millimeters times millimeters times millimeters is millimeters cubed. So the answer is 9 cubic millimeters. And I just want to make sure I divide it by 2 because there was a triangle in there. Okay, it canceled. So it's really just these two at the end. So the answer is 9. Let's try that out. There we go. Okay, so it's just multiplying those numbers together. Be sure that you have the layers, and then for triangular prism, make sure you divide by 2 because it's only half. Let me know if you have questions as you work on these, and I'll see you in class.